Everyone believed the male lion would do what nature had always dictated. In the wild, there are rules written not in words but in blood and instinct. Mothers guard their offspring, and adult males rarely remain near newborns. So when a lioness turned away from her cubs only hours after bringing them into the world, those who watched knew what usually followed. The father was moving closer, and by every known law of survival, his arrival should have meant death. Yet that morning, beneath the merciless Texas sun, something unfolded that defied every expectation. Something no one had anticipated. Something that would challenge everything people thought they understood about Power Family and the meaning of staying. Dawn slipped quietly across the high desert of West Texas, spreading a thin amber glow over mesquite trees and fractured earth. The horizon shimmered as if the land itself were waking reluctantly. Low hills in the distance still clutched the night's final coolness, guarding it like a secret. Wind brushed through the brittle grass with a soft, whispering sound, like pages being slowly turned in an unseen book. This expanse, broad and closed and carefully observed, was known as Red Mesa Wildlife Reserve, a privately managed stretch of harsh terrain where the wild still felt untamed, even as cameras blinked from concealed posts and satellites traced silent paths far overhead. Beneath a twisted mesquite, whose trunk resembled bleached bone, 3 newborn lion cubs lay huddled together in the sand. Their coats were still darkened and damp in places, clinging awkwardly to their fragile bodies. They were so impossibly small, they seemed as though they belonged in human hands, not in a world that demanded endurance from the first breath. Their eyes were sealed shut. Tiny paws twitched and curled as if they dreamed of warmth that was no longer there. Every few moments, one released a faint, searching sound, more breath than voice, before falling quiet again, conserving the little strength it possessed. Only a short distance away, their mother stood unmoving. To the researchers who tracked her movements, she was known as Luna. She was young, marked by a pale scar near her shoulder and a smooth, sand-colored coat that blended so completely into the desert that she often seemed to materialize from the air itself. But this morning she looked as if the land had taken something from her. Her breathing was quick and shallow. Her ears flicked at every distant noise before flattening again. She gazed at the cubs with an expression that refused to settle into anything familiar. It was not affection, not anger, not fear, not relief. It was emptiness. Distance. The birth had happened before sunrise, hidden beneath that same mesquite, while the stars still clung to the sky. It had taken longer than normal. Nights at the reserve were quiet, but quiet did not mean safe. Coyotes drifted like shadows beyond the ridge. An owl observed from a dead branch. Far away, a herd of pronghorn shifted uneasily, as if they had sensed some invisible change. Luna had chosen the spot for protection, low limbs, dense shade, the trunk behind her like a wall. As lionesses always do, she had separated from the pride, sought isolation, and attempted to usher new life into a world that rarely paused for mercy. Yet when it was finished, when 3 small bodies finally lay in the pale light of early morning, there was no softness in her face. For most creatures, the first moments after birth are pure instinct, cleaning, nudging, offering warmth without hesitation. A mother's body becomes shelter before the world has a chance to become a threat. But Luna did none of that. She stood trembling faintly, staring down at the cubs as if they were not fully real. As if something heavy and unseen lay between her and them, a burden only she could feel. The cubs wriggled weakly. One pressed its nose into the sand, blindly searching for milk, for comfort, for the familiar rhythm of a heartbeat. Another lifted its head with unsteady effort, mouth opening in a thin cry that cracked in the dry air and vanished before it could travel. The smallest barely moved at all, conserving what little life it held, its sides fluttering like fragile paper in the wind. Luna did not respond. Minutes slipped by. The sun climbed higher. The earth began to heat quickly, and without kindness, warmth rising from stone and soil as it always did in this part of Texas, as if the land remembered every brutal summer it had survived. A hawk traced a slow circle overhead. A beetle crossed the sand near the cubs and vanished into a fissure. Luna's gaze shifted once toward the horizon, and within that small motion was something final. Not thought, not cruelty, simply a closing door. She stepped forward. Her paws sank lightly into the loose ground. Her shoulders rolled with the weary, controlled grace of an animal shaped by endurance. She paused just briefly, the slightest hesitation like the world offering one last invitation to turn back. The cubs, sensing movement, struggled harder. One stretched out a tiny paw toward the place where warmth had been. It touched nothing but air. Luna took another step, then another. She did not look back. From far away it might have resembled indifference, but indifference carries ease, casualness. This did not. Luna moved like a lioness burdened by something invisible, as if the part of her meant to connect had slipped out of alignment, and her body was now obeying rules her heart could no longer reach. Across the reserve, inside a small camouflaged control building, a wall of monitors glowed faintly. Mara Caldwell, a field technician in her late 20s with sun-freckled skin and a tired ponytail, leaned forward until her face nearly touched the screen. The image was grainy tinted by early light, yet clear enough to show three fragile shapes beneath the mesquite and the pale outline of Luna moving away. Mara's hand hovered near her headset, as though she could physically intervene in what she was seeing. Beside her stood Dr. Evan Mercer, the reserve's consulting biologist. His arms were folded tightly across his chest. He had devoted his life to predator behavior, data probabilities, evolutionary patterns. He understood what abandonment meant in the wild. He knew how quickly mourning could become fatal for creatures that could not even lift their heads. Still, when he spoke, his voice came out lower than usual. "Is she leaving them?" Mara asked, though she already knew. Evan didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, on Luna's shape shrinking with each step, on the frantic, fragile movements of the cubs that somehow looked both desperate and slow. "She's walking off," he said at last. "No circling. No return." Mara swallowed. "That doesn't make sense." "Sometimes it does," Evan replied quietly. "Sometimes the body makes a choice the mind can't explain." On the monitor, Luna reached a patch of taller grass and slipped into it, her coat dissolving into the landscape until only a faint ripple remained. Then even that disappeared. The mesquite stood alone against the brightening sky, and beneath it, three newborn cubs lay exposed not only to heat, but to the simple, unbending truth of the world. New life does not bargain with nature. Mara's fingers curled tighter around the edge of the desk. "We can't," she began, then stopped herself. The reserve's regulations were uncompromising. No interference. That was the foundation of this place, to allow nature to unfold without human hands shaping the outcome, to observe without altering the narrative. But there was a difference between witnessing a hunt and witnessing abandonment. One felt like life following its ancient design. The other felt like something unfinished, a bond broken before it could even form. Evan reached toward his radio, then paused. Sending people in engines, voices, unfamiliar movement could disrupt everything. It might drive Luna farther away, scatter the pride, even endanger the cubs if their mother somehow returned. Human scent could cling to the land for days. Any intervention could spread consequences outward in ways no one could calculate. On the screen, the smallest cub trembled and released a thin, fragile sound that barely carried a noise that seemed less like a cry and more like a question. Mara whispered, not to Evan, not to anyone in the room, but to the image itself. Come back, Luna, please. The desert offered no reply. The sun climbed higher, and the patch of shade beneath the mesquite thinned. The cubs' bodies, so new, they still looked like they belonged to night rather than day, began to heat too quickly. Their tiny mouths opened and closed, searching for something they could not name. One dragged itself a few inches, bumped into the others, then fell still. Another raised its head, held it for a breath, and let it drop as if even that effort demanded more than it possessed. Evan exhaled slowly, like someone who had been holding his breath far too long. There's another variable, he said carefully. The pride's male. Mara turned toward him. Caleb. Evan gave a single nod. Even in a room filled with data and equipment, the name carried weight. Caleb, the dominant male of Red Mesa. 8 years old. Enormous. Seasoned. A lion shaped by victory and survival. He patrolled with the assurance of something that had never learned to doubt its place. He guarded the territory because it was his. He accepted the lionesses because they belonged to it. Cubs were the future, yes, but also a complication. Fragile points most dominant males left to the mothers. What will he do? Mara asked, though the fear in her voice suggested she already knew what answers history usually gave. Evan didn't look at her. That depends on what he decides those cubs represent. The camera view shifted wider as another sensor activated. Farther down the wash, near a rocky rise where a pocket of shade still lingered, a large form moved, slowly at first, then with intention. A lion stood. Even through the monitor, Caleb looked almost unreal. His mane was unusually dark thick around his neck like gathered storm clouds. He shook once, dust lifting from his shoulders, and the early light traced copper along the edges of his fur. He did not rush. He had no reason to. Every step carried the quiet authority of a ruler moving through his own domain. His head turned ears angling toward a faint sound, drifting on the breeze the weak, desperate calls from beneath the mesquite. Then he began to walk. Mara felt her stomach knot, as if her body recognized the danger before her thoughts could shape it. No, she breathed. Evan's hand hovered again near the radio. His jaw tightened, the strain of a decision written clearly in his face. On screen, Caleb crossed open ground, his paws silent against the sand. The rising sun framed him in gold. For a moment he looked less like an animal and more like something out of legend, the kind of figure stories invent to explain fear. Under the mesquite, the smallest cub lifted its head once more, mouth open, calling into empty air. In the control room, Mara's voice trembled, not with panic, but with the delicate ache of hope. Evan. If he reaches them. Evan did not answer her directly. His eyes remained locked on the screen. He swallowed, then spoke so softly, it sounded almost like a prayer. Watch, he said. Just watch. As Caleb's shadow stretched across the sand, Mara pressed her headset closer and whispered the only words she had left. Caleb, please don't. Caleb advanced with the unhurried authority of a lion who had never been shaped by urgency. His pace was steady, measured as he moved out from the lingering shade of the rocky outcrop and into the open ground that led toward the mesquite tree. With every step, he closed the distance between himself and the 3 exposed cubs, whose faint broken calls barely carried above the low breath of wind sliding across the desert floor. His mane shifted heavily over his shoulders, dark and dense framing, a face etched with old scars, faded signatures of conflicts resolved long before this morning. This land belonged to him. Every vibration in the air, every drifting scent, every subtle movement was part of a living map fixed deep in his awareness. Inside the control room, Mara leaned forward again, her breathing shallow, almost silent. The camera adjusted its zoom as Caleb drew nearer, bringing the cubs into sharper detail. Their tiny bodies moved in uneven rhythms, weak bursts of motion followed by stillness, as though their energy was draining faster than instinct could replenish it. The largest managed a thin, fractured sound. The smallest barely stirred at all its sides, fluttering too rapidly, too lightly. Dr. Evan Mercer spoke softly more to his own thoughts than to anyone else. In most documented cases, he said a dominant male encountering unattended cubs will evaluate them as a threat, a liability, or an unpredictable variable. Mara did not take her eyes from the screen. You mean he might kill them, Evan finished quietly. Not out of cruelty, out of logic. The words settled heavily in the air. In the wild, logic was stripped of sentiment. A lion like Caleb existed to secure territory. Territory meant access to food. Food meant survival, not only his own, but the pride's. His strength kept rival males away. Cubs were the future, yes, but only when they were protected by mothers, nourished, woven safely into the pride's structure. Abandoned cubs represented weakness. They drew predators. They diverted lionesses from hunting. They created openings other males could exploit. And in ecosystems shaped by pressure, vulnerability rarely survived long. On the monitor, Caleb slowed as he reached the outer edge of the mesquite's shadow. He lifted his head slightly, nostrils widening, as he drew in the layered scents clinging thickly to the air. Dust, dry leaves, sun-warmed bark, and beneath it all, the unmistakable trace of new life. There was another scent, too sharper, unsettled. Luna's, fresh, strained, laced with the chemical markers of exhaustion and stress rather than calm maternal presence. Caleb's tail flicked once. Mara felt her chest tighten. He knows they're hers. Yes, Evan said, he knows, but recognition did not promise mercy. Male lions often identified their offspring. That knowledge did not obligate care. In their world, fatherhood was rarely presence. It was blood carried forward, nothing more. Caleb stepped again, then once more. He stopped less than 10 feet from the cubs. From this distance, the contrast was merciless. His massive frame rose like a living cliff above three bodies so small they seemed almost unreal. His shadow stretched forward inch by inch, swallowing bright sand until it reached the cubs' paws. One of them reacted instinctively, wriggling weakly toward the cooler darkness, as if it were shelter. Its tiny nose pressed into shaded ground, searching. Caleb did not move. Seconds passed. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere far off, a cicada buzzed, then fell silent. A small cloud slipped briefly across the sun, softening the heat, then drifted away. The warmth returned at once, heavier than before. In the control room, no one spoke. Mara's hand hovered near the console, trembling with the urge to intervene to disrupt the unfolding moment with anything that might redirect it. Evan's eyes remained fixed, his expression unreadable, shaped by years of watching nature refuse to bend. This is the moment, he said at last. This is where instinct chooses. On screen, Caleb lowered his head. His muzzle drifted closer, close enough that his breath stirred fine dust around the cubs. He inhaled slowly, deliberately, as if reading information written only in scent. He nudged the sand near them, not touching. Not yet. The largest cub answered with a weak, hopeful sound. Mara closed her eyes for half a second, then forced them open again. She did not want to miss what came next, even if it hurt. Caleb's ears tipped back, then forward. His golden eyes moved from one cub to the next. He remained utterly still. There was no coiled aggression in his posture, no immediate threat. But neither was there softness. Not yet. Evan inhaled. A lion doesn't hesitate without cause, he murmured. But hesitation isn't compassion. Caleb's jaws parted slightly. Mara's breath caught. But instead of snapping shut, instead of the swift final motion everyone feared, Caleb closed his mouth again. He lifted his head a fraction. Then his body shifted not forward but down. He sat. The movement was controlled, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed around him. When his hindquarters settled into the sand, his enormous body cast a wide, solid shadow that rolled over the cubs like a dark wave. The temperature beneath the mesquite changed immediately. The cubs responded at once. Their movements altered, losing some of their frantic edge. One crawled blindly forward until it bumped into Caleb's foreleg. In the control room, Mara gasped softly. He's sitting with them. Evan leaned closer to the screen, eyes narrowed. He hasn't committed, he said carefully. Not yet. But something had undeniably shifted. The cubs were no longer fully exposed. They were no longer alone beneath the sun. For the first time since Luna walked away, something larger than themselves acknowledged their presence. Caleb stayed where he was. The cub that had reached his leg pressed weakly against it, drawn by warmth without understanding. Caleb glanced down, unreadable, then lifted his gaze outward, scanning the open land beyond the tree. His posture was different now, alert, oriented, not tense but aware, a stance no one in the room dared name. Mara felt tears sting unexpectedly. "Why would he do this?" she whispered. "It doesn't make sense." Evan's thoughts raced through explanations that felt thin even as he formed them. Territorial curiosity, sensory assessment, temporary tolerance, he said. Any of them could apply. None explained why Caleb remained seated as the sun climbed higher. Sometimes Evan added slowly behavior shifts when the cost of doing nothing becomes visible. On screen, the smallest cub stirred at last, drawn toward the cooler air. It made a soft, rasping sound and rolled slightly closer to Caleb's shadow. Its breathing eased just a little. Caleb did not touch it. He didn't need to. He stayed, and in staying he complicated everything. Shade was not milk. Protection was not nourishment. And the longer Caleb remained, the more visible this moment would become. Elsewhere in the reserve, scavengers moved. Lionesses rested. Luna walked alone, either unaware or unwilling to know what was unfolding behind her. "If he leaves," Evan said quietly, "they won't last another hour." "And if he stays?" Mara asked. Evan's gaze remained fixed on the monitor where Caleb sat, immovable as stone, 3 fragile lives pressed to the edge of his shadow. "Then he's already crossed something," he replied. "And there's no clean way back." Caleb lifted his head and released a low sound. Not a roar, not a threat. A deep vibration that rolled outward across the desert floor. Mara shivered despite the heat. What was that? That Evan said slowly wasn't reflex. Caleb's gaze swept the horizon, and for the first time since his arrival, something unmistakable settled into his posture. Resolve. The vibration faded. Dust drifted back to the ground. The faint rhythm of insects returned. Under the mesquite, the cubs remained close to his shadow. Their movements slowed. They did not know what had changed. Only that the burning sky had retreated and something solid had entered their world. The smallest cub nudged farther, its nose brushing the coarse fur of Caleb's foreleg. Contact. Caleb's muscles tightened not in violence but in awareness. He lowered his head slightly, breath warming the cub's back. Mara covered her mouth. Evan leaned forward until his reflection merged with the image. Caleb inhaled again, deeper this time, taking them in, not as distant scent, but as individual lives, warm skin, shallow breath, the unmistakable chemistry of new birth. The largest cub twitched. The middle one stirred legs, paddling weakly. The smallest leaned into Caleb's leg and went still, conserving what little energy remained. Caleb shifted his weight, not away. Closer. He angled his massive body so the cubs were no longer on the edge of his shadow, but fully within it. Then with deliberate care he lowered himself onto one side, foreleg bent, hind leg extended, creating a curved barrier of muscle and fur. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady rhythm. The cubs followed that rhythm without knowing why. One pressed against his chest, another settled into the hollow of his foreleg. The smallest rolled until its back touched the warmth of his belly and stopped moving. "He's lying with them," Mara whispered. Evan watched Caleb's face, searching for tension for reversal. He saw none. Caleb's eyes remained open, alert, scanning. This was not rest. This was watchfulness. "He's positioning," Evan said finally. "He's accounting for threats." Minutes passed. A distant shape moved along a ridge. Caleb's gaze locked onto it. His lips lifted slightly, revealing the edge of his teeth in a warning no camera could hear. The shape withdrew. Caleb eased just enough to breathe deeply again. One cub lifted its head and bumped weakly into his chest. Its tiny mouth opened and closed reflexively, searching for milk that was not there. For a heartbeat, tension rippled through Caleb. Evan feared this was where instinct would reclaim the moment. But Caleb did not snap. He did not stand. He stayed, and in staying, he allowed the impossible to continue. Inside the control room, Evan lowered himself into a chair before he was fully aware of the movement. His legs seemed to give in on their own. "This isn't hesitation anymore," he said quietly. "He's investing time." Mara remained motionless, eyes glossy, fixed on the live feed. But why, she asked again. What could possibly shift a lion like him? Evan shook his head once slowly. "Sometimes it isn't about what changes them," he replied. "Sometimes it's about what finally gets through." On the screen, another camera angle activated, tracking Luna's signal miles away. She was moving along a dry wash by herself, stopping briefly at a shallow pool to drink. Afterward, she continued on without pause, without a single glance back. Whatever fracture had formed in her had not yet healed. Back beneath the mesquite, Caleb adjusted his position by a few inches, lifting his chest just enough to deepen the pocket of shade. The cubs responded immediately, inching closer, their tiny bodies gathering into a tighter cluster against his side. The smallest released a faint sound, not a cry, but something softer, almost settled. Caleb looked down again. This time his gaze lingered. No one observing could say what passed through his awareness. Lions did not narrate their choices. They did not justify them. But something unmistakable had occurred. The cubs were no longer merely objects within his territory. They were factors he had chosen to preserve. The afternoon wore on. Heat shimmered across the open ground beyond the tree. Insects drifted in and out of the frame. The rest of the reserve continued its quiet negotiations with survival. Caleb remained, and in remaining, he reshaped reality into something that demanded answers he did not yet possess. Shade could not last forever. The cubs would soon wake hungry. Other Pride members would take notice. Scavengers would test boundaries. The price of this decision would rise with every passing hour. Caleb lifted his head and released another low sound, deeper now, shaped with intention. It was not a roar. There was no challenge in it. It carried no warning. It was a signal built from need rather than dominance. Across the reserve, ears turned, heads lifted. Something had been asked of the land, and whether the land would answer was no longer governed by simple instinct. The call faded into heat and distance, leaving the steady weight of afternoon behind. Under the mesquite, time resumed its slow advance. The cubs slept in short intervals, waking, shifting, then sleeping again. Each time they stirred, their bodies searched for something shade and warmth could not provide. Hunger announced itself quietly at first. The largest cub pressed its mouth more firmly into Caleb's fur jaw, working with fragile persistence. The middle cub followed, bumping clumsily into its sibling, tiny paws kneading uselessly. The smallest remained still longer than the others, then released a thin sound that was more breath than voice. Caleb's muscles tightened beneath his coat, not in anger, but in recognition. He looked down at the cubs, their mouths opening and closing against him, finding nothing. Shade had slowed their decline. Warmth had steadied their breathing. Neither could nourish them. Neither could replace what Luna had carried away when she left. Caleb rose carefully to his feet. For a split second, panic rippled through the control room. Mara's hand flew to her mouth. Evan's shoulders tensed, every instinct bracing for withdrawal, for abandonment, repeating itself in a different shape. But Caleb did not step away. He turned slightly, repositioning himself so his massive frame once again blocked the sun at its sharpest angle. Then he lowered himself back down closer than before, forcing the cubs into deeper shade. The movement was deliberate, measured. It bought them time, only time. Far-off clouds gathered faintly along the horizon, tall and pale, promising nothing. The air thickened. Even the wind seemed to grow tired, falling into long, breathless pauses. This was the hour when the desert tested every living thing. Caleb lifted his head and surveyed the land. His gaze moved ridge to ridge, tracking rocks, brush-open corridors. He was no longer only guarding. He was calculating. The cubs were no longer passive details in his domain. They were risks he had accepted, and risk drew attention. High above, a vulture traced a lazy circle, too distant to threaten, but close enough to matter. Caleb's lips lifted in a silent snarl. The bird drifted farther away. In the control room, Evan spoke. "They won't survive," he said, "not as speculation, but as fact. Not without milk." Mara nodded, tears blurring the screen. "He knows that." "Yes," Evan said softly, "and that's what makes this harder. He understands the gap." As if responding to that reality, Caleb leaned forward. His ears angled outward, and he released another sound, longer, deeper, designed to travel. Not a roar, a call. The cubs startled at the vibration, then settled again, drawn back into the shelter of his body. Caleb held the sound for several seconds before allowing it to dissolve into the afternoon. Miles away, lionesses lifted their heads. Grace was the first to respond. She had been resting near a rocky cluster with two younger females, conserving energy through the worst heat of the day. Grace was older, her movements slower, her face marked by seasons of hunts and loss. She had raised cubs before. She had buried some too. Experience lived in her bones. When Caleb's call reached her, she did not rise immediately. She listened. The sound carried urgency without threat, need without command. It was unfamiliar. Grace stood stretched and turned toward the mesquite. The others hesitated, reading her posture, testing the air. Then they followed, attentive, unhurried. Back beneath the tree, the cubs grew more restless. Hunger sharpened their movements. The largest attempted to lift itself fully and failed, dropping back into the sand. The smallest began to shiver again. Caleb lowered his head and nudged the ground near them, guiding them closer together. They responded weakly, pressing into one another or forming a fragile knot against his side. Minutes stretched. "If anyone can answer that call," Mara whispered, "it will be them." Movement appeared at the edge of the frame. First one shape, then another. Lionesses emerged from the heat shimmer, pale against dust. Caleb saw them before the cameras adjusted. He rose, mane lifting slightly, as the wind returned with their approach. Grace stepped forward. She stopped several yards away, assessing. Her eyes moved from Caleb to the cubs and back. Luna's scent lingered strongly. Grace's ears tipped back, then forward. Understanding passed through her posture. She advanced another step. Caleb did not block her. He shifted just enough to give her a clear view. An invitation without sound. Grace lowered her head and tested the air. Then she approached the cubs, moving slowly, carefully. She examined them one by one, her nose brushing their fur, cataloging condition and scent with practiced ease. The cubs responded instantly. They stirred, their mouths opened, their cries strengthened. Grace hesitated. Adoption among lionesses happened, but rarely. It depended on timing, condition, stability. Grace already had cubs, older, less dependent, still nursing occasionally. Accepting more mouths would cost her strength she could not easily spare. Caleb stood over them, unmoving. Grace made her choice. She lay down. The decision was unmistakable. She positioned herself so her flank faced the cubs, forming a protective curve alongside Caleb's presence. The cubs reacted at once, crawling toward her. One found her first, then another. The smallest took longer but eventually latched on. Milk. Their bodies eased as nourishment reached where warmth never could. Their cries softened into small sounds of effort and relief. In the control room, Mara collapsed back into her chair, tears flowing freely. She accepted them. Evan closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he said. She did. Caleb remained standing a moment longer, watching closely, ensuring they were truly feeding, truly anchored. Only then did he lower himself nearby, close enough to shield, far enough to give Grace space. The immediate crisis had passed, but the cost of what Caleb had begun was only starting to surface. By calling the pride, by staying, by insisting on life where death would have been simpler, he had altered the structure of his world. The cubs were no longer an isolated event. They were now the pride's responsibility. And responsibility in the wild always demanded payment. Caleb lifted his head again, scanning the horizon. The sun edged lower. Shadows lengthened. Evening would bring relief and new dangers. The cubs fed quietly, unaware their survival had rewritten the rules governing them. The desert did not celebrate small victories. It absorbed them and waited. As the sun slid lower in the sky, the desert finally began to loosen its grip. The brutal heat that had ruled the land all day softened, retreating inch by inch, leaving behind air that felt thinner, quieter, almost deceptive. Around the mesquite tree, the atmosphere shifted. What had been stillness turned into watchfulness. The cubs had fed until instinct itself seemed to power down. One by one, their small jaws released their tiny bodies, sagging into Grace's flank. Milk-drunk and utterly spent, they melted together into a loose knot of warmth and shallow breath. Their chests rose and fell unevenly but steadily, fragile, real, alive. Grace did not move yet. Nothing about her was relaxed. Her muscles remained subtly engaged beneath her coat, every nerve attuned to sound, vibration, scent. Adoption did not mean safety. It meant obligation. It meant attention. It meant risk. Every extra heartbeat she had taken responsibility for was a signal to the land. A short distance away, Caleb stood where he could see both the open flats and the shaded hollow beneath the tree. He did not lie down. He did not close his eyes. He could not. The choice he had made earlier in the day had shifted everything. Staying, calling, insisting. Those were not single acts. They were the beginning of a condition. And conditions demanded payment. The first hint of that payment came on the wind. It arrived not as a sound, but as a change. A faint alteration in the air that slipped across the sand and into Caleb's nostrils. His posture tightened instantly. His tail went still. His head lifted. Somewhere beyond the low ridgeline, something had registered what lay beneath the mesquite. In the control room, Dr. Evan Mercer straightened slowly. His gaze sharpened on the northern feed. "We've got activity on the perimeter sensors," he said quietly. Mara leaned forward, tension pulling her shoulders inward. "What kind of activity?" "Too organized to be nothing," Evan replied. "Could be hyenas." The words settled heavily in the room. Hyenas did not hunt like lions. They calculated. They observed. They tested. They specialized in imbalance, injury, distraction, birth, death, newborn cubs, a nursing female, a dominant male who had altered his routine. To hyenas, that was not chaos. That was opportunity. Out on the open land, Caleb rose. Grace noticed immediately. Her body coiled tighter, but she did not stand. Leaving the cubs, even for seconds, could undo everything. Instead, she adjusted her position, drawing her flank closer, shielding them more completely. Her ribs pressed into the cooling earth. The cubs slept on. Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between the tree and the direction of the scent. He did not go far. He didn't need to. Distance was not the point. Presence was. His shoulders squared. His mane lifted slightly in the evening air. This was not the relaxed authority of a ruler in familiar territory. This was focus. This was edge. The hyenas did not reveal themselves at once. They never did. First came sound. A soft chattering note that drifted across the flats. Then another. Then several more. Laughter without humor. Calls that bounced between rocks and brush, slipping in and out of space. They were not meant to threaten. They were meant to measure. Caleb answered. His roar shattered the fragile quiet. It rolled outward, deep and thunderous, packed with dominance, warning, and promise. Birds burst from nearby branches. Dust lifted from the ground. Beneath the mesquite, the cubs startled, then settled again as Grace pressed herself lower over them. For a brief moment, it seemed enough. Mara exhaled. They'll back off. Evan didn't respond. Movement flickered along the edge of the frame. Shapes pulled free from shadow. 3 hyenas, then 4, then more. They remained at a careful distance, bodies low, eyes, bright heads cocked. They did not scatter, they slowed, they studied. Caleb advanced, 1 step, then another. He deliberately widened the space between himself and the tree. He wanted them looking at him. He wanted their attention drawn away from what he guarded. This was not a territorial display. This was geometry. He was placing his body where it mattered most. A hyena laughed sharply. Caleb charged. The ground trembled as he surged forward in a controlled explosion of power. The hyenas sprang back instantly, fluid and quick, splitting outward. They did not flee. They fanned, testing, trying to stretch him thin. Caleb stopped. He pivoted, keeping all of them in view, his body a moving wall. His teeth flashed in the failing light. The standoff lengthened. Evening cooled into night. Shadows thickened. The air dropped another degree. The hyenas edged forward again, emboldened by numbers, by time, by hunger. Grace watched from beneath the tree, her eyes fixed on Caleb's back. She could smell his tension now, metallic, sharp. If he went down, everything would change. The hyenas knew that too. Caleb lowered his head, eyes locking onto the nearest form. The message was unambiguous. Come closer. The laughter faded. One by one, the hyenas began to retreat, still watching, still vocalizing softly, but moving back into the dark. Caleb did not relax until they were gone. Only when the final sound dissolved did he turn and walk back toward the mesquite. His pace had slowed. The effort of restraint showed in the way his shoulders rolled. Grace lifted her head slightly as he returned. Caleb lowered himself several feet away, facing outward once more. He positioned his body so that it formed a second barrier beyond Grace, layers of protection no biology textbook would have predicted. The cubs stirred briefly, then settled again. In the control room, Evan leaned back. That was the first payment. And it won't be the last, Mara said. No, Evan replied. It won't. Above them, stars began to appear, scattered with ruthless clarity. Caleb lifted his head once more, scanning the open dark. His breathing had steadied, but the tension had not left. It had simply taken up residence. He had chosen this. The cubs slept unaware that survival had already demanded conflict. Grace closed her eyes briefly. The night deepened, and then the insects stopped. The silence was wrong. Caleb felt it instantly. His weight shifted forward. His claws flexed into the sand. Stillness like this did not belong to rest. It belonged to impact. Then the scent reached him. Not hyena, lion, 2 of them. Young, male. Their smell carried hunger and ambition. Brothers, most likely. Recently forced from their birth pride. Searching. Testing. Caleb rose without hesitation and moved away from the mesquite. Every step was deliberate. He placed himself on a slight rise where his silhouette cut clearly against the stars. A warning. A roar ripped from his chest, deeper than before, layered with authority earned through years of dominance. The answer came quickly. One roar, then another, higher, less stable. The sound of lions who believed numbers could replace experience. Grace stirred beneath the tree, pulling the cubs closer. Caleb did not look back. He walked forward. The darkness parted. 2 shapes emerged. Their manes were thinner, lighter. Their bodies lean with the sharp hunger of exile. They circled, eyes locked on him, measuring. One lunged. The collision detonated in sound and dust. Caleb met the charge head-on, turning the impact with weight and timing. The second male rushed to flank him. Caleb twisted, slamming one aside, swiping at the other. Claws tore fur. A sharp line of blood appeared. The night exploded. Roars, snarls, the brutal percussion of muscle against muscle. In the control room, Mara grabbed her headset. They're engaging. 2 of them. He's outnumbered, Evan said. The fight surged. The younger males coordinated alternating attacks, testing his endurance. They were fast. They were relentless. They knew the prize. Caleb fought with a ferocity that exceeded territorial instinct. He absorbed impacts that would have turned another lion. He shifted constantly, protecting his throat, driving forward again and again, despite the fire building in his limbs. Blood marked the sand. One of the younger males faltered. The other pressed harder. Caleb seized the opening. He surged forward and locked his jaws around the larger brother's scruff, not to kill, but to dominate. He held long enough for the truth to register. Then he released and stepped back. The brothers regrouped, panting, bleeding eyes wide. They could continue. They might even win. But now they understood the cost. Slowly they backed away. Caleb did not follow. He waited. Only when they vanished did his body finally shake. He stood still, forcing his breathing to slow. Then he turned back. Grace lifted her head. Caleb lowered himself nearby. Exhaustion broke through his control. His breathing was rough. Fresh wounds darkened his coat. The cubs slept on. In the control room, Evan exhaled. That wasn't territorial aggression. Then what was it? Mara whispered. Evan watched Caleb's battered form, that he said was defense with no exit strategy. Outside, the desert slowly reclaimed its stillness. The chaos of the night receded, leaving behind a fragile calm. Above Red Mesa, the stars burned with distant indifference, cold and unblinking. They had witnessed countless struggles before this one, and would witness countless more. Caleb did not sleep. Not yet. Pain lived in his body now, not as a sharp scream, but as a deep, spreading weight that settled into muscle and bone. His shoulder throbbed. His flank burned. Each breath reminded him of what the night had taken. But behind him, beneath the mesquite, 3 small lives continued their fragile rhythm. The cubs breathed soft, uneven, real. The cost had arrived. Caleb had paid it. And he remained where he was without knowing how many more nights the desert would demand the same. Morning did not come dramatically. There was no sudden blaze of light, no clear dividing line between darkness and day. Instead, the blackness thinned. Shapes surfaced slowly, the twisted branches of the mesquite, the pale sand scuffed by tracks, and struggle the faint stains where blood had darkened the ground. Cool air lingered close to the earth, carrying dust, iron, and exhaustion. The land looked unchanged. It always did. The desert rarely displayed its reactions. Caleb was still awake. He lay exactly where he had settled hours earlier, body angled toward the open flats. Guarding no longer felt like a decision. It had become posture, habit, instinct reshaped. The worst of the pain had dulled into a constant ache. When he shifted, it was carefully done, every movement economical. He had learned long ago which motions preserved strength and which squandered it. Behind him, Grace stirred. She rose slowly, testing her balance, then stood. At once, the cubs responded, wriggling, pressing closer, their small voices stronger than the day before. Hunger had returned. But so had energy. They were no longer merely clinging to existence. They were beginning in the smallest ways to expect it. Grace lay down again without hesitation. The cubs found her quickly. Their mouths latched with more coordination, now their paws kneading with growing confidence. Milk flowed. Their bodies relaxed. Life continued. Caleb watched, eyes half-lidded, awareness never fading. He did not intervene. He did not need to. His place had shifted again quietly without announcement. He was no longer an outsider to the moment. He was part of its framework. In the control room, Mara leaned back for the first time since the night before. Exhaustion marked her face, red eyes, slack shoulders, but something steadier lived beneath it now. They made it through, she murmured. For now, Evan answered. He hadn't slept either. He stood with a cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hand, watching the live feed with the concentration of someone who understood that survival was not an event. It was a pattern. Over the following days, that pattern began to emerge. Caleb did not return to his former patrol routes. Instead, he reshaped them. His movements shortened, curved inward, keeping the mesquite and its fragile center always within sight or scent. The change did not go unnoticed. The lionesses were the first to adjust. They did not question. They observed. Everything in their lives depended on reading shifts before they announced themselves. Hunting schedules altered. Travel became tighter, more deliberate. Resting sites moved closer together. When Grace fed, at least one experienced female remained nearby. The pride did not grow fearful. It grew focused. Caleb became constant. When Grace left briefly with the others, he remained. He positioned himself close enough that the cubs could crawl against his side, pressing their warm, unsteady bodies into muscle that no longer recoiled from their touch. He tolerated their awkward climbing, their tiny teeth tugging at his mane, their paws swatting at his whiskers. He did not encourage it, but he did not forbid it. This was not affection in the human sense. It was permission, and in the wild, permission was powerful. One afternoon, as heat rippled across the flats, Luna appeared. She stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond the shade. She did not announce herself. She never had. Time had not weakened her. Her body remained strong, her movements fluid. But something in her stance had changed. Caution lived in her now. Her eyes moved across the scene, Grace lying with the cubs themselves already thicker through the limbs, more stable, and Caleb nearby resting with his head lifted. Luna stepped forward. The cubs sensed her before they truly saw her. One lifted its head, nose twitching. Another struggled upright and took several uncertain steps. They did not rush her. They did not cry. They watched. Luna stopped several yards away. Slowly she lowered herself to the ground, testing the space, testing the moment. Her gaze lingered on the smallest cub. Something tightened in her chest, something without a clear name. She did not move closer. Grace did not growl. Caleb did not rise. There was no confrontation, no reckoning. The pride did not work that way. Roles were filled, or they were not. Luna's absence had already been absorbed, replaced, restructured. After a while, Luna stood and walked away, slipping back into the brush. The cubs watched her go. Then they lost interest and returned to tumbling clumsily over one another in the sand. Caleb shifted, widening the patch of shade as the sun climbed. His body carried more scars, now visible markers of nights that would never be undone. But his movements had grown steadier, more efficient. Dr. Evan Mercer began to record the changes formally. What he documented went beyond movement maps and patrol routes. He logged proximity, interaction, timing. Caleb's involvement was not incidental. It was consistent. When Grace hunted, Caleb stayed. When danger approached, Caleb intercepted. When cubs wandered too far, Caleb redirected them not with teeth, but with mass and placement. "It looks learned," Mara said one evening, scrolling through days of footage. Evan considered. "Or chosen," he replied. "Those aren't always different." Weeks passed. The cubs grew. Their eyes opened fully, revealing the pale blue-gray of early life. Their legs strengthened. Their cries sharpened. They learned boundaries quickly, how far they could roam before Grace's warning sound summoned them back, how close they could approach Caleb before his sheer size redirected them. They also learned something else, that his presence meant safety. One evening, as the land cooled and shadows stretched long, a distant sound carried across the reserve, a single hyena's laugh far enough away to be only a suggestion. One cub froze. Another turned instantly back toward Grace. The third, the smallest, ran to Caleb. It pressed its body against his leg and stilled. Caleb did not look down immediately. He scanned the dark first. Then he lowered his head and touched the cub once with his nose. The cub settled. In the control room, Mara felt her chest finally loosen. "They trust him," she whispered. "They're learning from him," Evan replied. "That's different." As summer deepened, the desert shifted again. Water grew scarce. Prey patterns changed. Pressures mounted as they always did. But within the pride, something had stabilized. The cubs were no longer anomalies. They were structure. Caleb carried the cost of that structure quietly. He moved less, rested more. His injuries healed imperfectly, old pain, threading beneath new scars. Still, he did not retreat. He did not return to what he had been. Because by now it was no longer simply a decision. It was who he had become. Time continued its work the way it always had in the desert. It advanced without concern for hope or memory, pressing its mark into hide and rock alike. The seasons revolved with little ceremony. The punishing summer loosened into a gentler fall, only to circle back again into heat that settled over Red Mesa with familiar insistence. The cubs, who had once been nothing more than trembling bundles beneath twisted mesquite branches, grew into something stronger. Their limbs lengthened, their shoulders broadened, their paws struck the ground with heavier confidence. Play became practice. Their games filled the air with drifting dust and breathless energy, mock pursuits, sudden charges, clumsy ambushes that hinted at the hunters they were becoming. Caleb witnessed all of it. Age did not arrive suddenly, but it made itself known. His stride lost a measure of its former quickness. After long days, he rested longer. The scars he carried, some pale, some still dark, remained carved across his body. Quiet records of moments when retreat would have been simpler than remaining. To the young lions, he was never a mystery or a miracle. He was constancy. When they wandered beyond what instinct considered safe, they encountered his bulk before fear could take hold. When unfamiliar sounds rippled across the land, they drew close to him without prompting. They absorbed his habits, the way his head lifted before he settled, the way he positioned himself between open ground and risk, the way he measured when to advance and when to stay still. From him they learned without instruction that strength was not always motion. Sometimes it was restraint. Dr. Evan Mercer's records had grown thick. His work had shifted long ago from fascination to documentation. Patterns had emerged, clear, repeatable, impossible to ignore. Cubs raised within this altered structure showed measurable differences: how they responded to threats, how close they remained to one another, how they tolerated the presence of a dominant male. The implications unsettled decades of assumption. Yet it wasn't the statistics that kept him awake. It was the simplicity. No experiment had been imposed. No human boundary had shaped the outcome. One lion had adjusted his behavior, and the entire social fabric around him had reorganized. Grace, too, carried time in her body. Her face had begun to silver. Her pace softened. But nothing had weakened her authority. She had given more than nourishment. She had given continuity. The pride moved around her with the ease of something deeply practiced. Roles were understood. Conflict was rare. Luna remained within that system, though never again at its center. She hunted. She rested. She contributed. But she did not reclaim what had been lost. No force compelled her to. No reproach followed her distance. The young lions recognized her scent and shape, but they did not turn to her when unease rose. That bond had never formed, and time did not pretend otherwise. Caleb watched her without resentment. He accepted the shape the world had taken. As the cubs edged toward adolescence, the land shifted again. Distant roars carried heavier meaning. Territorial lines tightened. The brothers who had once challenged Caleb did not return, but others tested the margins. Each confrontation demanded more from him now. Every assertion required planning rather than instinct. Gradually, Caleb yielded space, not in collapse, not in surrender, but deliberately. His patrols shortened. He allowed younger males to move along the far borders without immediate resistance. This was not frailty. It was transition. Survival, he seemed to understand, sometimes meant choosing which battles no longer needed to be fought. The cubs observed this as well. One evening, as the sun spilled red across the horizon and shadows stretched thin across the sand, Caleb climbed a low rise overlooking the heart of the reserve. The young lions followed and settled around him in a loose half-circle. They were nearly grown. They were quiet, sensing the weight of the moment, without comprehending its full meaning. Caleb sat with his chest lifted, eyes fixed on the distance. He did not call out. He did not announce himself. He simply remained until the light thinned and the land cooled. Weeks later he was gone. There was no spectacle, no last stand, no visible end. One morning the pride rose and his scent no longer shaped the air. The land felt altered at once, not broken, but undeniably changed. Grace searched briefly, then stopped. She did not expect explanations from a world that never offered them. Dr. Mercer and Mara followed the faint traces of Caleb's movement for days, scattered impressions, subtle signs, a trail that angled south and dissolved. Weeks later, they found him beneath a solitary oak at the far edge of the reserve. He lay as if asleep. His body was still. His eyes were closed. Every line of him carried the evidence of endurance and age. There were no wounds, no sign of struggle. He had ended as he had lived quietly by his own choosing. The cubs did not witness his passing. They did not need to. His absence shaped them as clearly as his presence ever had. In time, one of the young males began to assume a greater role within the pride. He positioned himself closer to the smallest. He intercepted tension sooner than expected. The behavior was subtle, easy to overlook unless you knew what to recognize. Years moved forward. Red Mesa became first a reference point, then a documented case. Researchers arrived and left. Studies were published, challenged, refined. Some dismissed the account as coincidence, a rare alignment without broader meaning. Others saw evidence of something deeper, that learning not only instinct could echo across generations. But beyond the reports, the story traveled on its own. Visitors stood along observation platforms, while guides spoke of a lioness who departed and a male who remained. Parents watched their children grow silent, eyes wide, absorbing the notion that family could be shaped not only by biology, but by decision. In the control room, quieter now than it had once been, Mara watched recordings of the next generation. Young lions moved with assurance. They showed no fear of dominant males. They clustered quickly when risk appeared. She smiled before she noticed she was doing it. Then she brushed at her eyes a habit she never quite shed. "Do you think he knew?" she asked Evan one evening. Evan considered the question for a long moment. "I don't think it matters," he said. He didn't act for legacy. He acted because something in front of him needed him. On the land itself, the pride endured. Cubs were born. Some survived. Some did not. The desert remained what it had always been, severe, beautiful, indifferent. But within that world, a thread had been laid, quiet, resilient, enduring. The lions Caleb had guarded matured into adults who understood that power could be still. That authority did not always demand destruction. That remaining could be an act of strength rather than delay. Long after his body had returned to dust, that understanding persisted. Because territories shift, strength diminishes, even memory fades. But what is protected when no rule demands it can shape lives you will never witness. Caleb had remained, and that choice outlived him. If this story lingered with you even briefly, let us know. Comment 1 if you believe staying when it's difficult still holds meaning. Or comment 0 if you feel the world no longer recognizes that kind of strength. There are no correct answers, only honest ones. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, stories of quiet courage, unexpected bonds, and lives altered by a single decision, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll be here ready to share the next one.